Fruiting Bodies by Brian Lumley. My great-grandparents, and my grandparents after them, had been Easingham people. In all likelihood my parents might have been too, but the old village had been falling into the sea for 300 years and hadn't really much looked like stopping. And I was born in Durham City instead. My grandparents, both sets actually, had been among the last of the village people to move out, buying homes out of a government-funded disaster grant. Since when, as a kid, I had only been back to Easingham only once. My father had taken me one spring when the tides were high. I remember how there was this black, crusty snow lying in some odd corners of the field, colored by soot and smoke. All the things were in those days in the northeast. We'd gone to Easingham because the unusually high tides had been there again, chewing away at the shale cliffs, reducing the shoreline to derelict villages, both as the North Sea breakers crashed again and again on the shuttered land. And of course, we had hoped, and had 200 or so sightseers gathered there that day as well, to see a house or two go down in the smoking ruins, into the sea in foaming spray. We witnessed no such spectacle. After an hour or so, cold and wet from the salt moisture in the air, we piled everything back in the family car and moved back to Durham City. Easingham's main street, or what it had been since, was teetering on the brink of what was left, and by nightfall, that street was no more. We'd missed it, a further 20 feet off the coastline, a bite out of the city deep a few yards more than the one street long, and it undetermined, toppled, and gobbled up by the sea. That had been that, really. Bit by bit, in the quarter century, between then and now, the rest of Easingham was to be succumbed. Now only a house or two remained, no more than a handful in all, and all falling into decay, while the closest living buildings were those of farm on all the mile inland from the cliff. Oh, and of course, there was one inhabitant, old Garth Bentham, who had been demolished in the old house by hand and selling the bricks and timbers from the village for years. But I'll get to him shortly. So there I was last summer, back in the northeast again, and when my business was done, I of course dropped in overnight to the old folks at the Durham cottage. Once a year, at least, I try to make it a point to see them, but last year in particular I noticed how time was creeping up on them. The old folks. Well, now I saw that they really were old, and I determined that I must start to see them more often. Later, starting in on my drive back to London, I remembered that time when the old man had taken me to Easingham to see the house tottering on the cliffs, and probably because the place was not only in my mind, I inadvertently turned off my route and in a little while I found myself heading for the coast. I could have returned down a corner right there, and then indeed I intended to do so, but I got to wondering about Easingham and how little would be left of it by now. And before I knew it, once I'd got in my mind, Middlesbrough was behind me, and then Guisborough, and in no time, I was in the old road onto the village. There was ever only one way in and out, and this was it, a narrow road. It surfaced, started to crack now, and all tall hedgerows broken down there, here and there, letting you through out to the old fields that rolled down the cliffs. A beautiful day with seagulls wheeling overhead, a salt tang coming in from the wound-down windows, and a blue sky coming up to merge with blue-gray of the North Sea itself. For cresting a rise, and suddenly, I was there. An old leaning wooden sign that said Easingham, for the tail had been broken off or rotted away. Usually in the village, on the sign, it lay on the end of the road, but there, blocking the way, was a metal barrier and set in a massive concrete posts, and carried a sign bearing the following warning: danger, severe cliff subsidence, no vehicles beyond this point. I turned off my car's motor and got out. I leaned on the barrier. Before me was the road that went on and disappeared, only 30 yards ahead. They were stretched in the new rims of the cliffs. Of the village, Easingham itself, forget it. On the side of the cliffs, reaching back on both sides of the road, behind overgrown gardens, weedy paths, and driveways, here stood the empty shells of what had once been the residence of this posh folks of Easingham. Now, even on a day as lovely as this one, they were morose in their desolation. The windows of the derelicts, where there were windows at least, seemed to gaze gauntly down at the approaching doom, like old men in twin rows of deathbeds. Brambles and ivies were rank. The whole place seemed to despairing as the cries of the gulls ran to the warm air. Easingham was a place no more. Not that there ever had been a lot of it, but 3 streets lengthwise with a few shops, 2 or more shorter streets cutting through, at least 3 at right angles and going down to the cliffs, and the vegetarious wooden steps that used to climb through the branch of the bay, and the old harbor and the fish market, standing over in the bay actually, a Methodist church and a jutting promontory, which in the old times had been served as a lighthouse. But now, no streets, no promontory, nor church or harbor, fish market, ricketory steps, no Easingham. "Gone, all of it," said a wheezy, tired old voice directly behind me, causing me a start. "Gone forever to the devil in the deep blue sea." I turned, formed words, and something barely coherent from the leathery old scarecrow of a man I found standing there. Did I startle you? I have a way to say it startled me. First car I've seen in a 3-month. After bricks, are you? Cheap bricks? Timber? No, I told him, finding my voice. I'm, sightseeing, I suppose, I shrugged. I just came off to see how the old village was going on. I didn't live here, but a long line of my people did. I just thought I'd like to see what much was left. What was left, actually. Except it seems I'm a little too late. Aye, too late. 3 or 4 years too late. That was when the last of the old fishing houses went down 4 years ago. Sea took 'em. Take 6 or 7 feet off the cliffs each year. Yeah, and I lived long enough to take it down me too. But it won't cost you, I'm getting out a bit. And he grinned and nodded as if you were to say, so that's that. Well, sightseeing. Not much to see, though not now. Do you fancy a coffee? Before I could answer, he put his finger to his mouth and blew a piercing whistle, then paused and waited to look ahead and shook his head in puzzlement. Ben, you're my old dog. He's not been himself lately, and I don't like to think of him strayed too far. He was out all night, was Ben. Still, it's summer, and there may have been a bitch about. While he had talked, I looked over him, and I decided that I liked him. He reminded me of my own grandfather, what little I could remember of him. Granddad had been a miner in one of the colliery villages farther north, retiring here to doze off and dry up and die, only to find himself denied the choice. The sea's incursion had put paid to that when it finally made its place untenable. I fancied this old lad had been a miner too. Certainly he bore the scars, the stigmata of the miner, the dark, leathery skin with the black speckles bedded in, the bad, bowed legs, and the shortness of breath, making of short sentences, a generally gritty appearance overall, though I'd no doubt that he was as clean as freshly scrubbed. Coffee would be fine, I told him, holding out my hand. Greg's my name. Greg Lane. He took my hand and shook it firmly and nodded. Garth Bentham, he said. And then we were off swiftly back up the crumbling roadside, some 2 or 3 houses, and turning right into an overgrown garden through a fancy wooden gate and separated and painted white. I intended to keep doing the whole place up, he said. as I followed close behind him and did the gate, part of the fence. Wouldn't you know, I ran out of paint. Before letting us into the dim interior of the house, he paused and whistled again for Ben. Then, worriedly, he shook his head into something concerned. After the rats in the old timber yard up again, I suppose, but God knows if I wish he'd stay out of there. And then we were inside the tiny clock room, where the sun filtered through the fly-speckled windows and probed the golden searchlights of a few fairly dilapidated furnishings and the brassy face of an old grandfather clock that clucked like a mechanical hen. Dust motes drifted into the tiny planets and cosmos of fairy, edging round my host where he had guided me through the door and into the living room. Where the dust had settled on the occasional ledge, I noticed that it was a twinge of red, like rust. I cleaned the windows from here, Garth informed. So, the sea is the sea, I like to see what it's up to. Making sure it doesn't creep up on you, I say. His eyes twinkled. Nah, I was just joking, he said, tapping the side of his blue-veined nose. No, I'll be 10 or even 20 years before all this goes. But I don't see it going very long. 5 if I'm lucky. I'm 68 after all. 68? Was that really? It had to be old as that. But he probably was right. A lot of old-timers from the miners didn't even last that long. Not entirely mobile and coherent, anyway. Retiring at 65 doesn't leave you a lot, though, does it? I said. Of time, I mean. He went into the kitchen and called back. Me? I've been a 10-year. Didn't retire. Quit. Stuff your pension, I told him. I'd rather have my lungs. Oh, what's left of them. So I came here, just got to this place for a song, and take care of myself and my dog, and no one to tip my hat to, no one to bother me. I get a letter once a fortnight from my sister in Dunbar, but these days the postman filled up in the attachment here. He'll think, well, I won't come around here no more. He wasn't bemoaning his fate, but I felt sorry for him anyway. I settled myself in on a dusty seat and looked out for the window down across his garden of brambles to the sea's horizon, a great curved mill pond for the time being. Didn't you have any savings? I could have bitten off my tongue at that moment. I'd said it, for that was to imply that he hadn't done very well himself. Cups rattled in the kitchen. Savings? Lad, when I was a young'un, I had 3 things on my mind. My lamp, my helmet, and a pack of cards. If it wasn't pitching and tossing and waiting them pennies on the bench banks, it was a 3-car brag and a back room of a pub. Oh, I was a gambler. Right enough, but a bad one. In my blood. It's like my old man before me. My mother never did see a penny, nor his wife. I'm ashamed to say, before he moved out here, God bless her. Savings, though. I was a laugh. Out here, no bookies runner. You'd be damned hard to find a hard card school in Easingham these days. What the hell? He shrugged. And he got back into the room. It was life. We sipped our coffee, and after a while... Have you been on your own very long? I mean, your wife? Anne? He glanced at me, blinked, and suddenly there was a peculiar expression on his face. On my own, you say? He straightened his shoulders and took a deep breath. Well, I am on my own in a way, and in a way I'm not. I've been. Or, what he's gone off to, what he's doing to come home. And Lily-Ann? Not all that far. In fact, I suspect she's sort of watching over me, keeping it company, keeping an eye on me, so to speak. I have that feeling especially lonely. Oh? Well, I mean, she is here now. Now, isn't she? It was a statement, not a question, though. Here? I started with having my doubts about him. I had her buried, he nodded, which explained what he had said, and produced a certain sensation of relief in me. There's a Methodist church up here over a while ago, at this old burying ground. The church went on a donkey's year ago, of course, but the old graveyard was still there when Lily Ann died. Was? Our conversation was getting one-sided. Well, it still is, but right on the edge, so to speak. It wasn't so bad then, though, and I got permission to have the service done there. And down she went, where I could go and see her, and I could still go and see her if I wanted to. Of course, now and then, but in another year or two, the sea. He shrugged again. Time and the tides, ain't waiting for no man. We finished our coffee. I was going to have to be on my way soon, and suddenly I didn't like the idea of leaving him. Already I could feel the loneliness, the feeling it creeping in. Perhaps he sensed my restlessness, or something. Certainly I could see that he didn't want me to just go yet. In any case, he said, "Well, maybe you'd like to walk down with me past the old timber yard and visit her grave. Oh, it's safe enough. You don't have to worry, but we may even come across old Ben down there. And he sometimes visit her, too." "Ah, well, I'm not too sure about that," I answered. "The time, you know." But by the time we got down the path to the gate, I was asking, "So, how far is the churchyard, anyway?" He could tell me. Maybe I'd find some long-lost lanes in there. He led the way back to the barrier where he had spanned the road, bent his back and ducked and groaned under it, and then turned left to an overgrown communal path between two gardens, where the houses had been stepped down in a declining gradient. The detached bungalow on our right once a pair still standing, while a third slumped on the raw edge of oblivion. Well, it had decayed almost to the point where it was collapsing inwards. Brambles luxuried everywhere in the garden, completely enclosing it. The roof sagged as it went in the chimney and threatened to topple it, making the whole structure seemingly highly suspect and more than a little dangerous.
Partly subsistent because of the undercutting action of the sea, Garth explained, but mainly the rot. There's a lot of wood in these places, but there's a lot eaten away. I made myself a living barely out of the old bricks and timber in Easingham, but I had to be careful, and don't do it to sell stuff with the rot in it.
"The rot?" I asked. He paused for a breath, leaned on one hand on hip, nodded and frowned.
"Dry rot," he said. "Old Merulus Liamanus, they call it in the books. It hasn't been bad in these last 3 years. It's very bad, actually. But when the last of these old houses are gone, and that's what's left of the timber yard, and that'll be gone too."
"It?" We were getting back to the single-word questions again. "The dry rot, you mean? I'm afraid I don't know very much about it."
"Places on the coast are prone to it," he said. "Whitley, Scarborough, the places like that. All the damp sea spray and the bad plumbing. The rains that come down from the inadequate draining. That's how it starts. It's a fungus. It needs moisture to get started. You don't know much about it, though? Heck, I used to think I knew quite a bit about it, but now I'm not so sure."
But then I'd remember something. A friend of mine in London did mention to me how he had been living in his flat and had treated for it, he said. Expensive, apparently.
Garth nodded and straightened up. "Hard to kill," he said. "And when it's active, it moves like the plague. It's active here, too. And too late for Easingham, and who gives a damn anyway, but you tell that friend of yours to get sort of the exterior maintenance first. The gutters and the drainage. Get rid of the water spillage, and then deal with the rot. If the place is dry and airy, it's okay. Damp and musty spells danger."
I nodded. "Thanks. I'll tell him."
"Want to say something?" Garth said. I'll show you what the old Morelius can do. And see here, these old paving flags? See if you can lever one of them up a bit. I found a piece of rusting iron stave and dredged it out on the ground where it had been slumped into a rotting fence, and then forced the sharp end into the crack between the two overgrown flags. And while I worked to loosen the paving stone, old Garth stood watching and carried on talking. Actually, there's a story attached, if you care to hear it, he said. Probably all coincidental and circumstantial, or something other big words like that, but queer the way it came about all the same. He was losing me again. I paused in my levering, so I looked bemused, and maybe to wonder what on earth I'm still doing here, and then grunted and sweated, gave one more heave, and flipped the flag over on its back. Underneath was hard, packed sand. Well, it looked like it, at least. It shrugged, and then looked at Garth. He nodded and put his the way he did and grinned. Look now tell me what you make of that. He got down on one knee and scooped a little sand out of the way. Just under the surface of his hands was some sort of obstruction. Garth wrinkled his nose and grimaced and got his face close down to the earth. He blew his weakened lungs and started coughing. Then he sat back down and rested. Where he'd been scraping and blown away the sand, and made out what appeared to be a gray, fibrous mass running along at right angles right under the paveway. It may be 6 inches thick, though this tightly packed cotton wool. It might have easily been fiberglass lagging of some pipe or something. And I'd said as much. But it ain't, Garth contradicted me. It's a root, a feeler, a tentacle. It's old man cancer of self. Timber cancer. One move and he'll be looking to be a new victim. One more and you won't see him moving. That strange look was back on his face. Or at least, you shouldn't. But anyway, he finished. He finished with the houses there. He nodded at the derelict steeping down towards the new cliffs. And now, he's gone on into the houses that he left here. Another couple of summers like this one, and he'll be through the entire row to my place. Except maybe I'll burn him out first. You mean this stuff? This fiber is dry rot? I said. I stuck my hand into the stuff and tore a clump out of it. It made a soft tearing sound like damp chipboard, except it was dry as old paper. How do you mean you'll burn him out? I mean what I says, he said, Garth. I'll search out and dig up all those threads of mycelium, what they're called, and set fire to them. Now they smolder right through with a fine white ash, and God, it stinks. Then I'll be for the fruitin' bodies and the what? His words had conjured something in me that was vaguely obscene in my mind. Fruiting bodies. Oh, Lord, yes. You want to see? Just follow me. Leaving the path, he stepped on over a few low brick walls and to struggle through the undergrowth of the garden to our left. Taking care as not to get tangled up in the brambles, I followed him. The house seemed pretty much intact, but a bay window in the ground floor had been broken out and all the glass had tapped out of the frame. My winter preparations, Garth explained. I burn the wood, you see, before winter comes. I get into a house. I look like this one up here. I rip out all the wood fixings, and break them down, ready for burning. The wood just stays here while I stack it, all prepared and waiting to be burned with bad weather. I knocked this window out last week, but not been inside yet. I could smell it, you see. He tapped his nose, and didn't much care for all those spores on my lungs. He stepped up onto the pile of bricks, got one leg over the sill, and stuck his head inside. Then, turning his head in all directions, he systematically sniffed the air. Finally, he seemed satisfied and disappeared inside. I followed him. Spores? I said. What sort of spores? He looked at me.
He wiped his hand away along the window's ledge and held it up so that he could see the red dust that accumulated on his fingers and palms.
"These spores," he said. "Dry rot spores, of course. Haven't you been listening?"
"I have been listening, yes," I answered sharply. But I had to ask you, spores, mycelium, fruiting bodies. I mean, I thought dry rot was just, rotting wood."
"It's a fungus,"
he told me, a little impatiently.
Like a mushroom, and it spreads in such a way, except it's destructive. Once it starts, it's bloody hard to stop."
"And you, an ex-coal miner," I started at him in the gloom of his house we'd invited to. "You're an expert on it, right? How come, Garth?" Again, there was this troubled expression on his face, and in the dim interior of the house he didn't try too hard to mask it. Maybe he'd be as circuitous about it as he seemed to be about everything else.
"Because I've read up in books. You see, that's how," he finally broke into thought. "To occupy my time. When I first saw it spreading out in the old timber yard, I looked it up, and he gave sort of a grimace. "It's interested, is all."
By now I was wishing I was on my way again, but by that I mustn't misunderstood. I mean, I'm an able-bodied man, and I wasn't afraid of anything, and certainly not Garth himself, who was just a lonely, canny old-timer, but all this was really getting to be a waste of my time. I had just made up my mind to go back out through the window when he caught my arm.
"Oh, yes," he said. "This place is really ripe with it. You can smell it. Even the windows. Bust 'em wide open, look at this. This place is nicely dried out in the summer here. Still, it's stinking the place out. Now you just have to see here, what you'll see."
Despite myself, I was interested, and indeed I could smell something. A cloying mustiness? A mushroomy taint? But not the nutty smell of fresh field mushrooms, more of a sort of vile stagnation. Something dead might smell like this, long after the actual corruption has ceased. Our eyes had grown somewhat accustomed to the gloom. We looked around the room.
"Be careful how you go," said Garth. "See those spores in there? Try not to stir 'em up too much. They're worse than snuff, believe me."
He was right. The red dust lay fairly thick on just about everything. By everything, I mean a few old sticks of furniture, the worn carpet under our feet, and the skirting board up in the various shelves and ledges. Whichever family had moved out of here, they hadn't left a whole deal of stuff behind. The skirting was heavy. It was old-fashioned, about an inch and a half thick, 9 inches deep, with a fancy molding along the top edge. They hadn't spared the wood in those days. Garth peered suspiciously at the skirting board above, in a way that the bay window, and paused. At every pace to scrap the toe of his boot down its face, and eventually, when he did this, suddenly the board crumbled to dust under the pressure of his toe. It was literally as dramatic as that. The white paint cracked away, and the timber underneath fell into a deep, black, smoking dust. Another pace, and Garth kicked it again, and the same result. He quickly exposed a 10-foot length of naked wall, which had been cut even with plaster, was loose and flaky, and showed me where the strands of the cottonwood mycelium had come between the bristlework and the plaster from below.
"It sucks the cellulose right out of the wood," he said. "Gets right into the brickwork, too. Now look here."
He pointed to an old carpet under his feet. The threadbare weaved and showed as it raised a floor of blossoms of stains, like a blotch or a blister, spreading outwards away from the wall. Garth got down on his hands and knees.
Just look at this," he said.
He tore up the carpet and carefully laid it back. Underneath the floorboards were wrapped dark stains, shriveled so as to leave little wide gaps between them. And up through the gaps those were white, elongated threads spreading themselves along the underside of the carpet. I wrinkled my nose in disgust. "It's like a disease," I said.
"It is a disease," he corrected me. "It's a cancer. and houses die of it. Then he inhaled noisily. Pulling a face of his own, he said, right here. He pointed to the warped, rotting floorboards, the very heart of it. Give me a hand here. He got his fingers down between the boards and gave it a tug, and it was at once apparent that he wouldn't be needing any help from me. What had been a stout wooden floorboard, a full inch thick, was now brittle and dry bark. It cracked upwards, flew apart, and revealed the dark cavities between the floor joints. Garth tossed bits of crumbling wood aside, and tore up more boards, and at least the very heart of it lay at our inspection. There, Garth said, with a sort of grim satisfaction. He stood back and wiped his hands down on his trousers. Now that is what you call a fruitin' body. It was rough, about the size of a football. It was clearly not exactly that shape, though. It was suspended between two joints in a cradle of fibers, and adhering to one of the joints was partially flattened. The thing might have been a great too-ripe tomato. It had been a bright yellow in the center and banded in various shades of yellow from the middle out. It looked freakishly weird, like a bad joke. This lump of stuff, never a mushroom, just nesting there between the joints. Garth touched my arm and I jumped a bit. He said, You want to know where all the moisture goes? Out of this wood, I mean? Well, touch it. Touch that. Heck, it ain't gonna bite you. It's just a fungus. All the same, I'd rather not, I told him. He took a piece of floorboard and prodded the thing, and it squelched. At the simmered point of the wood, it sank in like jelly. Its heart was mainly liquid, and porous as a sponge, like a huge egg yolk, I'd say. Isn't it? He said, his voice very quiet, plainly fascinated. Suddenly I felt nervous. The heat, the oppressive closeness of this room, the spore-laden air. I stepped dizzily backwards and stumbled against an old armchair. The rat had been there, and been for a chair just fragmented into a dozen pieces and puffed, the yellow dust all over the place. My foot sank right down through the carpet and the mushy boards into the darkness, and stretched in another moment I'd panicked. Somehow I stumbled myself back through the window and embedded up into the brambles. Then Garth was standing over me, shaking his head and tut-tut-tutting. I told you not to stir up the dust, he said. It chokes your air and stifles you. Worse than being in a pit, am I right? My heart stopped hammering, and I was, of course, all right. I got up. Just a touch of claustrophobia, I told him. I suffer from it at times. Anyway, I think I've taken up enough of your time, Garth. I really should just be going on my way. What? He protested. A lovely day like this, and you want to be driving off somewhere. And besides, there's the things I wanted to tell you, and others I'd ask you. We haven't seen much down Lily Ann's grave yet. He looked disappointed. Anyway, you shouldn't be driving if you've been feeling all shaken up like that. He was right about that part anyway. I did feel shaky, not to mention foolish. Perhaps more importantly, I was still very much aware of the old man's loneliness. What if it was my mother who had died, and my father had been left to his own up in Easingham? Very well, I said, at the same time damning myself for being a weak fool. Let's go and see Lily Ann's grave. Oh, good, Garth slapped my back. No more diversions. We gotta go straight there. Following the paved path before and climbing the gentle rise, we started walking. We angled a little inland from the unseen cliff. The green rolling fields came to an abrupt end and fell down to the sea. And it was then when I gave a little thought to the chain of incidences in which I had found myself involved in through the last hour or so. Now, I'd been a liar if I said there was nothing that struck me strange in Easingham, and for quite a bit had. Not least the dry rot. its apparent profusion and migration throughout this place, and the old Garth in particular's knowledge and understanding of the stuff, his affinity with it. You said there was a story attached, I reminded him. To that horrible fungus, I mean. He looked at me sideways, and I sensed that he was on the point of telling me about something. But at that moment we ceased that rise, and just a view took my breath away. We could see for miles up and down the coast, to the slow, white breakers rolling in on some beach way down north, and southwards to a distant, mist-filled seaside town. We might even see White Bay. And then we paused to fill our lungs with good air blowing fresh from the sea. "There," Garth said. "And how's this for freedom? Just me and old Ben in the gulls for miles and miles. I'm not sure, but that this is the way I like it. Now, wasn't it worth it to come up here? All this open space, and this great curve of the horizon." Then the look of satisfaction slipped from his face and was replaced by a more serious expression. "There's an old Easingham cemetery. What's left of it, is." He pointed down towards the cliff where the baldy, weathered stone wall formed in part of a square whose sides was maybe 50 yards long in the old days. But in those days, it also had a stubby promontory and a church. Now only one wall was remaining parallel to the perch. It stood complete beyond, with 2/3 of the churchyard had been claimed by the sea. Its occupants too, I suppose. "See, that's half the timber shack," Garth said, pointing. "At this end of the cemetery, that's what's left of Johnson's mill. Johnson's sawmill, that is, actually. The shack used to be old man Johnson's office. A long line of Johnsons ran a couple farms that had enclosed all the fields around here, right down to the cliffs. Pasture mostly, with a lot of fine animals grazing here and there, but as the fields got eaten away and the buildings themselves started to be threatened, that's when half the Johnsons moved out and the rest started bought a big house in the village. They gave up farming and started the mill, and started the timber and the local building trade. Folks around here said that it was a sin, all that noise of sawing and planning, right next door to a churchyard, no less, but it was old man Johnson's land, after all. Well, the sawmill business was keeping till a time, some 7 years ago, when really a bad blow took a huge bite right out of the bay one night. The seaward wall and the graveyard went, and half the timber yard too, and that closed old Johnson down. He sold what machinery he had left, plus a few stacks of good oaks that hadn't suffered too much, and moved out, lock, stock, and barrel. Just as well. The next few springs, the big house and the 2 others on the edge of the cliffs got taken too. The sea got 'em in the end. Before then, I thought, at a time when just about everybody was moving out of Easingham, Lily Ann and me, we moved in. As I told you, we got our bungalow for a song. And of course, we picked ourselves a house standing just well back from its brink. We were getting a bit, another 20 years or so, and it'd see us out. After the sea, it could do it. It was worse, but, well, didn't quite work out that way. While he talked, Garth had led his way down to the open fields of the graveyard wall. The light breeze was blurry from here, and it flustered his words and back into my face. "You see, within a couple of years of our settling here, the village was derelict, and all the remaining people was us of a handful of Johnsons still working the mill. And then Lily Ann came down with something and died, and I had to put her in the ground here in Easingham, so's I'd be near her, And that's where the coincidences started to come in, for she went only a couple months after the shipwreck. Now, I don't suppose you remember that. It wasn't much, just an old Portuguese freighter that found in a storm. Lifeboats took the crew off, and it was already unloaded of her cargo. Somewhere up the coast, actually. So the incident didn't really make much of a to-do for the newspapers, but she'd carry a fair bit of hardwood, ballast, and old ship, and the bulks of the stuff that would keep them drifting ashore. Great lengths, 12 by 12s. Of course, Old Man Johnson wasn't one to miss out on a bit of good timber like that. Not when it's, being washed up right here on his doorstep, so to speak. Anyway, Lillian died and I had to make proper arrangements. And I went down to the old Johnsons and told me if I could make a coffin out of this Haitian hardwood. Haitian? And maybe my voice showed something of a surprise. That's right, Garth said more slowly. He looked at me worryingly. Anything wrong with that? I shrugged and shook my head. Rather romantic, I thought. I said, timber from a tropical isle. I thought so too, he agreed. And after a while, he continued, well, despite having been here in the sea and stuff, it cuts here, heavy panels, and still the French polished a beautiful finish. So that was that. Lillian got a lovely coffin, except... yeah? I prompted him. He pursed his lips. Except I got to thinking later, as to know how the rock came here in that wood. God knows it's a damn funny variety of fungus after all, but then this Haiti, well, apparently it's a damned funny place. They call it the Voodoo Island, Black magic, I said. I think we've advanced a bit beyond thinking of black magic, right, Garth? Well, maybe not, he answered. But voodoo or no voodoo, it's still a funny place, that Haiti. Far away and exotic. By now we'd found a gap to the old stone wall and climbed over it and tumbled into the graveyard proper. From where we stood, another 20 paces would take us straight into the raw edge of the cliff, where it was a sheer dead straight through the overgrown. Badly neglected plots and headstones. So, here it is, said Garth, pointing. Lillian's grave. Secure for now in what little is left of Easingham Cemetery. His voice fell a little and grew ragged. But the fact is, I wish I'd never put her down there in the first place. And I'd give anything that I hadn't buried her in that coffin built in by Old Man Johnson's balsa wood. The plot was a neat oblong packed in, with oval pebbles. It had been weeded out round here in the border, and in the bottom, the foot of the simple headstone was dedicated with flowers, some wild, others cut from Easingham's deserted gardens. It was deep in flowers. The one underneath withered in a bit compared by all those on top. Obviously, Garth had come here more than just once, now and then. It was the only plot in sight that had paid any sort of attention. But the circumstances, that wasn't surprising. You're wondering why so many flowers, eh? Garth sat down, raised the slab close by. I shook my head and sat down beside him. No, I know why. You must have thought the world of her. You don't know why, he answered. I did think the world of her. But that's not why. It's not the only reason, anyway. And I'll show you. He sat down on his knees beside the grave and began laying aside the flowers. Right down to the marble chips he went. He scooped an amount of polished gravel on one side and made a small mound of it. Whatever I had expected to see in that small excavation, it wasn't the cylindrical, fibrous surface-like of the upper section of a lagged pipe which came into view. I sucked in my breath sharply. There were tears in Garth's eyes when he flattened the marble chips back into place. You see, the flowers are here so I won't have to see it if it ever breaks the surface, he said. See, I can't bear the thought of that filthy stuff in her coffin. I mean, what if it was like what you saw under the floorboards? The house back there, he said again. His eyes trembled as he took out an old wallet and removed a photograph and gave it to me. Oh, that's Lily Ann, he said. But God, I don't like the idea of that stuff fruiting on her. Aghast at the thoughts his words conjured, I looked at the photograph. A homely woman in her late 50s, seated in the chair beside the fence in the garden. I recognized as Garth's, except the garden had been well tended then. One shoulder seemed slumped in a little, and though she smiled, still I could sense that there was some pain there. It was just a few weeks before she died, said Garth. It was her lungs. Funny that. I worked in the pit all those years, and it was her lungs that gave out. And now she's here. And so's this stuff. I had to say something. But where did it come from? I mean, how did it come? Well, here. I don't know much about dry rot, no, but I would have thought it would confide itself into houses. And that's what I was telling you, he said, taking back the photograph. The British variety does, but not this stuff. It's weird and different, and that's why I think it might have to come from, where that blasted wood came from. As to how it came from into the churchyard, well, that's easy. Come and see for yourself. I followed him, where we made our way between the weedy plots towards the leaning half-timber. Is that the source? Johnson's timber yard? He nodded. For sure. But look here. I looked where he had pointed. We were still in the graveyard, approaching the timber wood wall behind, beyond the sound of which the derelict shack.
Running in a parallel series along the dry ground, from the mill and into the graveyard, deep cracks showed throughout the tangled brambles, briars, and grasses. One of these cracks, wider than the others, and had especially split heavy on the horizon marble slab right above its length. Garth grunted. That's what done the last time I was here, he said. The sea's been at it again, I nodded. Undermining the cliffs. Maybe we're not safe here, you think? He glanced at me. No, it's not the sea this time, he said, very defiantly. Something else entirely. See, there's been no rain for weeks. Everything's dry, and it's getting thirsty, same as we do. Give me a hand. He stood beside the broken slab and got his fingers into the crack. It was obvious that he intended to open the tomb. Garth, I cautioned him, isn't this a little ghoulish? Do you really intend to desecrate this grave? You'll see that date, he said. 1847. Heck, I don't think he'd mind. Whoever he is. Desecration, though? Why, he might even thank us for this sweet little sunlight. What are you afraid of? There only can be dust and bones down there now. Full of guilt, I looked all about while Garth struggled with his frantics with a fractured slab. It was a safe bet that there wasn't a living soul for miles around, but I checked anyway. Opening graves isn't my sort of thing, but having discovered him was for a stubborn old man, I knew if I didn't help him, he'd find a way to get it done by himself anyway. And so I applied myself to the task. Between the two of us, we wrenched open one of the two halves to the edge of the base. Finally, it toppled over. A choking fungus reeked at one end once we rushed and engulfed us. Or maybe the smell of it was just something else, and I'd simply smelled what I expected to. Garth pulled a sour face. Ugh, was the only comment. The air cleared and we looked in the tomb. In there. A coffin just over 3 feet long, and the broken sarcophagus around it, filled with dust, cobwebs, and a few leaves. Garth glanced over at me in the corner of his eye. So you think I'm wrong, eh? About what? I answered. It's just a child's coffin.
Just a little one, eh?
He nodded. His little coffin looks to be intact, doesn't it?
But is it?
Before I could reply, he reached down and rapped his horny knuckles on the wooden lid. And despite the fact that the sun was shining down at us from all the seagulls that cried to the world seemed at peace, still, my hair stood on end at what happened next. For the coffin lid collapsed like a puffball and fell into the dusty debris. And, God help me, something in that box gave a grunt and puffed like it was something alive into view. I'm not a coward, but there are times when my limbs just have a will of their own. Once, when a drunk insulted my wife, I struck him without consciously knowing I had done it. It was that fast, the reaction, that instinctive, that the same now. I didn't have pause to draw breath until I'd cleared the wall halfway up the field and paved path. And even then, I probably wouldn't have stopped, except I tripped and fell flat and knocked all the wind out of me. By the time I had stopped shaking and sat up, Garth was puffing and panting and all the slope towards me.
"It's all right,"
he was gasping. "It was nothing, just the rot. It had grown in there and crammed itself so tight, so confined, that when the coffin caved in..." He was right, and I knew it. I had known it was, even with my flesh crawling up my legs, my heart and lungs pumping. But even so, there were bones in it, I said, contrary to common sense. A skull. He drew close and sank down beside me and gulped in the air. "That little one's bones," he said, "caught up in the fibers. I just wanted to show you the extent of this thing. I didn't want to scare you to death." I know, I patted his hand, but when it moved, it was just the effect of the box collapsing, he explained, logically. Natural expansion. Set free, it was unwound like a jack-in-the-box, and the noise it made, that was the sound of it scraping against the rotten timber, amplified by the sarcophagus. I know all that. It shocked me, that's all. In fact, 2 hours in your bloody Easingham have given me enough shocks for a lifetime. But you see what I mean about all this rot? He stood up, and both of us, still a little shaky. "Oh yes, I see what you mean. I don't understand your obsession, that's all. Why don't you just leave this damn stuff alone?" He shrugged, but made no answer. And so we made our way back towards his home. And on our way, the silence between us was broken once. "There," he said, looking over back towards the brow of the hill. "You see him?" I looked back, saw the dark outline of an Altesian dog silhouetted against the rise. Ben? Even I had spoken the name, so the dog disapparently into the long grass beside the paths. "Ben!" he called, and blew his piercing whistle, but with no result. The old man worriedly shook his head. "Can't think of what's come over him," he said. "Oh, then again, I'm more his friend than his master. We've always pretty much looked after ourselves. At least I know he hasn't run off." Then we were back at Garth's house, but I didn't go in. His offer for another coffee couldn't tempt me. It was time that I was on my way again. "If you ever back this way," he said, as I got into the car. I nodded and leaned out of my window. "Garth, why the hell don't you just get out of here? I mean, there's nothing here for you now. Why don't you just take Ben and just clear out?" he asked.
"Where do I go? And anyway, Lily Ann's still here. Sometimes in the night, when it's hot and I have trouble sleeping, I can feel that she's very close to me. Anyway, I know you mean well."
And that was that. I turned the car around and drove off. It acknowledged his final wave by lifting my hand briefly in the air, so he'd see that. Then, Driving around a gentle bend as the old man sideslept out of the way of my rearview mirror, I saw Ben. He was crossing the road in front of me. I applied my brakes and let him get out of the way. It could only be Ben, I suppose, a big Altesian, shaggy, yellow-eyed, and yet I caught only a glimpse. I was more interested in controlling the car and being sure that I was, safely out of the way. It was only after he'd gotten through to the hedge and out of sight that that an afterimage of the dog surfaced in my mind. The way he'd seemed to limp, his belly hair so long as it hung in the trail on the ground. Even though he wasn't slinking, a bright splash of yellow on his side, as if he'd brushed up against something freshly painted. Perhaps, understandably, peculiar images bothered me all the way back to London. Yes, and for quite some time after. Before I'd known it, a year had gone by, then 18 months, and memories back to those strange hours spent in Easingham were fast receding, faded with them, and the promise that I had made to myself to visit my parents more frequently. And then I got a letter to say that my mother hasn't been feeling too well, and another one on its heels to say that she was dead. She'd gone in her sleep, nice and easy. This last was from a neighbor of theirs, but my father wasn't much for writing until now, or much of anything else, for that matter. The funeral would be on at, etc., etc. God, how guilty I felt driving up there, and more guilty with every mile that flashed under the car's wheels. And all I could do was choke the guilt and the tears back and drive, and feel the dull, empty ache in my heart that I knew my father would be feeling in his. And of course, that was when I was reminded of old Garth Benningham in Easingham, and my advice that he should just get out of that place. It had been a cold sort of thing to say to him, even cruel, but I hadn't known him for that long, and I hadn't thought, really. We laid Ma to rest, and I stayed with the old man for a few days, but he really didn't want me around. I thought without saying, why don't you just settle up, come and live with us in London? He had plenty of room, but I thought of Garth again and kept my mouth shut. Dad would work it out for himself in the fullness of time. It was late on a Wednesday afternoon when I started out for London again, and I kept thinking how lonely it must be for old Easingham, and I found myself wondering if Garth ever took a belt or filled a pipe, if he could even afford to, and I'd promised him that if I was ever back up this way, I'd go and look him up, hadn't I? I stopped at the off-license and brought a bottle of half-decent whiskey and some pipe and rolling tobacco, and a carton or two of cigarettes, and held a few cigars. Whatever was his pleasure, I probably covered it. And if he didn't smoke, well, I could give the tobacco goods to someone who did. My plan was to spend just an hour with Garth, and then head up for the motorway and drive to London in darkness. I don't really mind driving in the dark, when the weather and visibility are good and the driving lanes are all but empty. And the night music kept me sharp and clear of the radio that keep me awake. But approaching Easingham down the neglected cul-de-sac of a road, I saw that I wasn't going to have any such easy time going at it. A storm was gathering out of the sea, piling up the thunderheads like some beetling black brows along the twilight horizon. I could see continuous flashes of lightning from there, and even before I reached the destination, I could hear the high seas thundering against the cliffs. When I did get there, well, I held back from driving quite as far as the barrier, because only a little way beyond, my headlights had picked out black, empty space. Of the 3 houses which had stood closest to the cliffs was one left, and the one slumped right into the rim. So I stopped directly opposite of Garth's place and gave a honk of my horn, then switched off and got out of the car with my carrier bag full of gifts. Making my way to the house, the rush and the roar of the sea was peaceful and audible, transferring itself physically throughout the earth at my feet. Indeed, the bleak, unforgiving ocean seemed to be working its way up into a real fury. Then, in a moment, the sky darkened over and risen, and the rain had come down out of nowhere. Just bitter cold and squally, and I found myself running up to the overgrown garden path to Garth's door, which was when I began to feel really foolish. There was no sign of life beyond the grim and grimy windows, neither a glimmer of light showing nor a puff of smoke or chimney. Maybe Garth had taken my advice and gotten out of there after all. Calling his name over the rattle of distant thunder, I knocked on the door, having a long minute before there was still no answer. But this was not good. I was getting wet and angry with myself. I tried the doorknob, and the door swung open. I stepped inside, into the deep gloom, and groped on the wall near the door for a light switch. I found it, but the light wasn't working. Of course it wasn't. There was no electricity. This was a ghost town. Derelict, forgotten. The last time I was here had been broad daylight. But Garth had made coffee for me. On a gas ring? It must have been. Standing near in the small cloakroom, shaking rain off myself, I seemed just as I remembered. Several pieces of tall, dark furniture, pin-paled interior walls, the old grandfather clock standing in one corner, except that this time the clock wasn't clucking. The pendulum was still, a vertical bar of brassy fire was where lightning suddenly just brought the room to life. Then it was dark again. If anything, even darker than before. And the windows rattled as thunder came down rolling beyond the drumbeat. "Garth!" I called out again, my voice echoing through the darkened house. "It's me, Greg Lane. I drop by sometime." No answer. Just the hiss of the rain outside, the feel of my collar damp against my neck, and the thick, rising smell of what? And then suddenly I remembered very clearly the details of my last visit here. "Garth!" I tried one last time, and I stepped into the door in the living room and pulled it open. And as I did, I came into a lull, beating rain. I heard the floorboards creak under my feet, but I also heard a groan. My sensitivity at once rose to several degrees. Was it Garth? Was he hurt? Oh no. What had he said to me that time? One of these days the postman will find me stretched out in here, and he'll think, well, I needn't come here around here anymore. I had to have light. There'd be matches in the kitchen, maybe, if there was a torch or something. In the absence of any main supply, Garth would surely have had a torch of some kind. Making my way shufflingly, very cautious around the dark room, around the kitchen, I was conscious that the smell was concentrated here. Was it just the smell of an old, derelict house, or was it something worse? Then, outside, lightning flashed again, and briefly the room lit up in a white glare. Before the darkness fell once more, I saw someone slumped in an old seat chair where Garth served me coffee. "Garth?" The word came as a half-strangled. I didn't want to say it. It just gurgled from my tongue. For though I had only seen a silhouette outlined in the split-second flash, it hadn't looked like Garth at all. It had been much more like someone else. It had once seen on a photograph. That dropping right shoulder. My skin prickled as I stepped on shivering feet through the open door into the kitchen. I forced myself to draw a breath, to think clearly. If I'd seen anyone or anything at all back there, it could have been just some old boxes piled up on the seat, or a roll of carpet leaning there. And it most certainly it probably had been Garth, which would explain that groan. It was him. Of course it was. But in the storm, and remembering what I did at this place, my mind was playing morbid tricks on me. No, it was Garth. And he could be in serious trouble. I got a grip of myself, quickly looked around. A little light came into the kitchen through the high back window. There was a 2-ring gas cooker, a sink, and a drain board with a dryer under the sink. I pulled open the drawer and felt around inside. My nervous hand was unmistakably a box of matches, and yes, the smooth, heavy cylinder of a hand torch. And all that time I was aware that something or someone might be slumped up on the seat just a few swift paces away through the door to the living room. With my hand still inside the drawer, I pressed the stud of the torch and was rewarded when the weak beam probed out and turned my fingers pink. Well, it wasn't a powerful beam, but any sort of light would be better than total darkness. Armed with the torch, which felt as good as any weapon in my hand, I forced myself to move back into the living room and directed my beam towards the seat. Oh, but Jesus, all that sat there was a monstrous gray mushroom. It was a gray, fibrous mass growing out of it, wielded with mycelium strands on the seat, and it was in the center, the obscure yellow fruiting body. Oh, but for God's sakes, it had the shape and outline and looked like an old woman. And it had Lillian's deflated chest and slumped shoulder. I don't know how I held the torch. I don't know how I kept from screaming out loud while I simply didn't fall unconscious. That's the sort of shock I experienced, but I did none of those things. Instead, on nervous legs, I backed away, backed into an old wardrobe, a Welsh dresser. At least, I backed to what I thought had been a piece of furniture, but now it was something else. Soft as sponge, the thing collapsed and sent me sprawling. Dust, I imagined, dark red spores rose up everywhere, and I skidded onto my back, and shards of crumbling wood, matted wet fibers, and lolling out into the darkness behind me, where the dresser had stood, bloated out like some loathsome puppet or dummy. A second fungoid figure leaned towards me, and this time it was in the caricature of Ben. He lolled there, held up on 4 fiber legs, muzzle snarling, soundlessly. For all in the world had tensed up to spring, and all he was just a harmless fungus thing. And yet this time I did scream. Or I think I did, but the thunder came to drown me out. And then I was on my feet. My feet were through the rotten floorboards, and I didn't care except I had to get out of there, out of that choking, stinking, collapsing. I stumbled, crumbled my way into the tiny cloakroom, tipped a knee crashing into the clock where it stood in the corner. It was a nightmare chain reaction, which I had started and couldn't stop. The old grandfather clock just crumbled in on itself, its metal parts clanging together as the wood disintegrated around them, and all the furniture following suit, and the very wall paneling smoking into the ruin where I fell against it. And there where that infected timber had been, and there he stood, old Garth himself. He leaned out half against the wall like a great nodding mannequin, his entire head a livid yellow blotch, his arm and hand making a noise like a huge puffball bursting underfoot where they had separated from his point and floppingly towards the door. I needed no more urging. "Oh, God, yes, I'm going," I told him as I plunged into the storm. After that, nothing. Not for some time. I came to in a hospital in Stolsky about noon the next day. Apparently I'd run off the road on the outskirts of some village or another, and they dragged me out of my car, which had been laid upside down in a ditch. I was banged up, and I couldn't do much talking, which was probably as well. But in the papers I read below of how what was left of Easingham had gone into the sea in the night. The churchyard, Haitian timber, terrible dry rot fungus, the whole thing sliding down into the sea and washed away forever in the tides. And yet now, I sometimes think, where did all that wood go that Garth had been selling for years, and what of all those spores I'd breached and touched and rolled myself around in? And sometimes when I think of things like this, it makes me feel quite ill. I suppose I shall just have to wait and see. And that concludes my Scary Stories segment for October. I got to tell you, it's pretty different, and it's a pretty exciting time making these. I hope you enjoy them, because I think I might be doing these, just continuing these. I have a book of Best of Weird Tales that I've been reading from. It used to be an old Barnes & Noble's exclusive that I got at a resale shop, but let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Should I keep doing more of these? What stories would you like me to do in the future? Still working on those intros, but damn it, I'll figure out how to end these videos proper.